Page 110 continued. In matters of religion, the Puritans were fanatics. They were extremists. There had been Puritans even during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. They did not accept the Anglican Church, which was essentially a compromise between Catholicism and Protestantism. They considered its creeds and public worship as too much like popery. They advocated church reform. Moreover, they had very strict views about life and conduct. They laid down very austere ideals of life. They were against common pleasures, even innocent ones, example drama, and considered singing and dancing as immoral, and hence in the beginning the term Puritan was a term of contempt applied to such extremists. We find frequent satirical references to them in the plays of Shakespeare. The general tendency of the Puritan was antisocial. Beauty in his eyes was a snare and pleasure a sin. The only mode of social intercourse which he approved was a sermon. As Macaulay put it, he hated bear baiting, not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectator. The Puritans thus stood for first, church reform; second, for the reform of social life according to their austere ideals; and third, for the ideal of liberty, both religious and political. Man should be free to worship according to his own conscience, unhampered by the state. The wise Elizabethan compromise in matters of religion broke down with the accession of James I to the throne. The extremists, the Puritans and the Jesuits, extreme Catholics, had never taken kindly to the Church of England, based largely on a compromise between the Catholic and the Protestant claims. But these extremists dared not raise their voice as long as the popular and tactful Queen ruled the destiny of the nation. But the extravagance and immorality of the court under James I, his ignorance of the English tongue, and the consequent failure to communicate with the people, his uncouth appearance and awkward manners, his theory of the divine right of kings advanced as a justification of his despotic rule, and the fact that his queen was a Catholic, all contributed to his unpopularity and the antagonism of the people. Impact on literature. This was a great gain for the Puritans. The ordinary citizen sympathized increasingly with Puritans, with their emphasis on thrift and economy and the purity of the home. Criticism of the church and the court increasingly became more vocal and widespread, and resulted ultimately in the Civil War and the beheading of Charles I. The critical temper of the age is reflected in its literature, poetry, prose and drama. The times were out of joint, and pessimism and satire are the natural result of the dissatisfaction with the existing order. The melancholy poesy of 1590s and the early years of the 17th century is not a mere affectation. It is an expression of the inner gloom and the frustration of the age. It is also seen in the morbid preoccupation of the writers of the age with the themes of decay, dissolution, disease, sickness and death. Impact on literature. This was a great gain for the Puritans. The ordinary citizen sympathized increasingly with the Puritans with their emphasis on thrift and economy and the purity of the home. Criticism of the church and the court increasingly became more and more vocal, and widespread and resulted ultimately in the Civil War and the beheading of Charles I. The critical temper of age is reflected in its literature, poetry, prose, and drama. The times were out of joint, and pessimism and satire are the natural results of the dissatisfaction with the existing order. The melancholy poesy of 1590s and the early years of the 17th century is not a mere affectation. It is an expression of the mere gloom and frustration on its job of the age. It is also seen in the morbid preoccupation of the writers of the age with the themes of decay, dissolution, disease, sickness, and death. Tactlessness of Charles I. James I was sufficiently clever and died just sufficiently soon, and thus in his reign there was no open conflict between the king and his people, but he left behind him serious problems for his son Charles I, 1625. Charles was handsome, cultured, and graceful, just such a king as likely to win the hearts of his people. However, he was tactless and did not attach much importance to public sentiments. He surrounded himself with evil counselors and with their help tried to enforce the divine right theory of kings. End of page 110, now page 111. His absolutism aroused the apprehensions of the people. His politics, he was entirely unscrupulous. Moreover, he had a Catholic queen and was himself suspected of having Catholic leanings. His policies, both religious and political, both in Scotland and Ireland, were complete and abject failures. The treasury was already bankrupt, and he and his courtiers were not at all not only profligates but also highly extravagant. In dire need of funds, he appealed to the Parliament, which demanded even greater privilege for itself. No compromise was possible between the despotic Charles and the Parliament, consisting mainly of elements hostile to the king. The stress and strain in national life increased, resulting in the civil war between the king and the Parliament, which broke out in 1640. The nation was divided into two factions: the supporters of the Parliament, mainly Puritans, known as the Roundheads; the supporters of the king, known as the Cavaliers; and the supporters of the Parliament, mainly Puritans, known as Roundheads. The Civil War had an adverse effect on the literary activity, and there was a general decline in standards. As a result of Puritan opposition, there was a complete collapse of drama, and the theatres were closed down in 1642. King Charles I was beheaded in 1649, and the royal family member, with a few staunch supporters, As a result of the Civil War had an adverse effect on literary activity, and there was general decline in standards. As a result of Puritan opposition, there was a complete collapse of drama, and the theatres were closed down in 1642. King Charles I was beheaded in 1649, and the royal family, together with the few staunch supporters, sought shelter in France. A Puritan government or commonwealth, headed by Oliver Cromwell, was founded in 1649. For 12 years, till the death of Cromwell in 1659, 1659, the Puritans ruled the country and entertainment of every kind was banned. The influence of Machiavelli, Machiavelli, Machiavelli. The bewilderment and confusion of the age was made worse, confounded by certain new and materialistic interpretations of the world order. The most potent influence in this connection was that of Machiavelli. Machiavelli the Prince was widely read, but his teachings were largely misunderstood. Machiavelli was understood to provide a materialistic and satanic interpretation of the world order. Spiritual and moral theories of the governance of the universe were rejected. It was not God but Satan who was the supreme power. This was why spiritual theories and moral theories of the governance of the universe were rejected. It was not God but Satan who was the supreme power. That is why weakness, ingratitude and ill will, wickedness, ingratitude, ill will, wickedness, cruelty, etc. are essential elements of human character and society, and religion is merely an instrument of exploitation in the hands of kings and princes. This materialistic view, tinged with Satanism, clashed with the biblical and Christian interpretations and diabolic creed, a faith in cynical self-seeking and aggression. Under the impact of such theories, the hero turned villain on the Jacobean stage, and diabolism, ruthless self-seeking to the utter disregard of all moral and humanitarian considerations, became the dominant theme even of such great dramatists as Webster and Tournier. Faith in the older world order was thus shaken, but a new and more stable order had not yet been evolved. Man was literally caught between two worlds, and the disillusionment, fear, and anxiety born of naturality and equality, literally caught between two worlds, and disillusionment, fear, and anxiety born of uncertainty were the natural result. The two worlds, indeed, in more ways than one, the medieval world order was disintegrating in the first half of the 17th century. This was so much so the case that it had become usual to speak of the two worlds of writers like Donne, the disintegrating medieval world of scholastic philosophy, science and metaphysics, and the rising world of the new philosophy. The medieval world, medieval, medieval world. Up to the last quarter of the 16th century, the medieval scholastic philosophy and worldview still held sway. The chief features of this medieval worldview may be summarized as follows. A. The universe was still conceived according to the old Ptolemaic astronomy as a vast system of concentric spheres with the earth at the center. The spheres carried the moon, the sun, and the planets and the stars. The substance of these celestial bodies increased in refinement and purity in proportion to their distance from the earth and beyond the outermost sphere by empyrean heaven, the abode of God. The whole system was bound together in a divinely appointed order, always thought of us as hierarchical. B. From mere matter up to God, there stretched a continuous chain of being in which the man formed the vital central link. Between him was animal, vegetable, and intimate matter. Above him, celestial intelligence and the various orders of angels. C. A complicated harmony was manifest in the constant correspondences between different planes of existence. In order of the cosmos was parallelized in the order of the state. The state or the body politic was an organic unity analogous to man himself, and man was the microcosm, a little world replied in miniature situation in a miniature situation in the organization of the whole universe. D. As the whole universe was composed of different combinations of the four elements fire, air, water and earth, so human temperament was the result of varying blends of the four corresponding bodily fluids of humor, choler, blood, phlegm and melancholy, black bile. E. In such a concept of the world and man's place in it, physics, physiology, psychology, philosophy and religion seemed to the modern mind to be hopelessly intermingled. They had not been distinct disciplines. Yet at the beginning of this period, these ideas were still receiving serious and eloquent expression by, for example, Raleigh and Shakespeare, and they were to remain for many years a commonly accepted background to thought. F. Knowledge was still based to a considerable extent on the authority of earlier writers, on deduction from traditional theology, or on the ingenious working out of analogies, rather than on the observation and experiment. The road to learning was still the traditional one of grammar, rhetoric and logic, and university education was still largely medieval in concept and method. G. Above all, faith and reason were not commonly set in opposition to each other, and their spheres were not sharply distinguished. The new philosophy. By the turn of the century, this medieval view of the order and structure of the universe was being shaken by the new philosophy. Page number 112. The new philosophy. By the turn of the century, this medieval view of the order and structure of the universe was being taken by the new philosophy, the term which was used to designate experimental or empirical science. The Renaissance itself had done much to widen the mental horizons of the age and induce newer modes of thought. The discoveries of Columbus and other navigators and explorers had changed the map of the world and fired the imagination with immense possibilities and opened new vistas. The rediscovery of Greco-Roman humanistic culture, art and literature gave a knockout blow to medieval aesthetic and other worldly outlook. The medieval cosmology and philosophy were shaken by the rise of the new philosophy, which was already a catchword at the beginning of the century, and by the Restoration, scientific experiment was achieving a fashionable status. Breakdown of medieval ideas. The new astronomers exploded the cosmology of Aristotle and Ptolemy. The earth no longer remained the center of the universe. The sun was no longer supposed to move around it, but it was shown that it was the earth which moved round the sun. Thus man's faith in his own importance and that of his planet was shaken. The invasion of the old cosmology by the new philosophy brought a sense of disorder, dissolution and decay of the cosmos. The sense of disorder and decay was the subject of the works of many writers. It was an age of transition in which the old order collided with the new, and the writers like Donne were virtually suspended between two worlds, the old world of decay and the new world of progress. The collision of the two worlds was best seen in the changes that were introduced in university curriculum. Logic, rhetoric and theology were the main subjects of study in the medieval setup. Now, growing importance was attached to the study of astronomy, mathematics, physics, chemistry and other sciences. The Royal Society for Science was founded and scholasticism came to be regarded as a term of contempt. Faith in alchemy soon disappeared and its place was taken by the study of chemistry. In short, the early half of the 17th century was a period of tension, a period of great stress and strain. The older traditions, values and ideals, the older order, social and moral orders were subjected to increasing criticism and faith in them was shaken. Man was bewildered and confused, pessimistic and melancholy. All this was reflected in the satirical and critical temper of the literature of the period. Literary background. Persistence of tradition. The English literary scene at the turn of the 16th century and the early years of the 17th displayed a curious complexity and diversity. A host of writers belonging to the previous age lived on and continued to produce well into the new age. Shakespeare and Bacon, Drayton and Daniel were only a few such names. Literary background. Persistence of tradition. The English literary scene at the turn of the 16th century and the early years of the 17th displayed a curious complexity and diversity. A host of writers belonging to the previous age lived on and continued to produce well into the new age. Shakespeare and Bacon, Drayton and Daniel were only few such names. Much that was old and traditional survived and continued to exist side by side with the new and the experimental. There were a number of poets, for example, who continued to follow the Spenserian and the Arcadian tradition. The vogue of the pastoral continued, but these were things of the past. The future lay with the new trends that were visible even in the early years of the 17th century. The chief literary trends of the new age may be summarized as follows. End of page 112, now page 113. Satire and realism. As R.G. Cox points out, there was an increase in skepticism, introspection, self-consciousness and self-criticism. The chief literary trends of the new age may be summarized as follows. Satire and realism. As R.G. Cox points out, there was an increase in skepticism, introspection, self-consciousness and self-criticism. In literature, this resulted in a growing emphasis on satire and realism. Satire was everywhere, in prose, in poetry, and on the stage. Joseph Hall is believed to be the first English satirist. Marston was a great satirist, and Donne's poetry was not only satirical but often cynical and brutal in tone. The professed aim of Ben Jonsonian comedy was satirical, that is, to laugh folly out of court. Ben Jonson represented the typical antithesis of Shakespeare. Romance and imaginative exuberance in him were replaced by classical self-control and realism. Love poetry. The Elizabethan love poetry was largely Petrarchan. There were also the medieval and Platonic strains in Elizabethan love poetry. In the New Age, love poetry was characterized by increasing realism. Thus, Donne emphasized that to be a satisfactory relationship, love should be a mutual passion. Claims of the body were recognized, and the woman was no longer treated as a goddess but as a creature of flesh and blood. New style. The language of poetry had grown too poetic, and a conventional and stereotyped phraseology was used by poet after poet. Classical mythology was freely exploited for decoration and imagery. In the New Age, there was a development of new styles. The older rhetorical method in verse, with its copiousness and formal elaboration, gave way to a more concentrated manner, following more closely the diction and rhythms of speech, to what were called at the time strong lines, and to what became known later as metaphysical wit. In prose, there was a reaction away from Ciceronian eloquence as a model towards the packed terseness of Seneca and Tacitus. The first can be seen in the tragedians and in the poetry of Donne, the second in Bacon's essays. As so often, the old and the new continued for a long time side by side. Donne turned out the company of gods and goddesses, rejected the over-poeticized conventional vocabulary, and drew upon the arts and sciences and the world of daily trade and commerce for his purposes. In his poetry is best seen the contemporary fondness for strong lines, that is, lines highly charged with meaning and employing startling figures of speech. There were marked changes in style and interest. R.G. Cox rightly says, the metaphysical school. There were marked changes in style and interest. R.G. Cox rightly says that the main agents of change and the dominant molders of the new tradition were John Donne and Ben Jonson. And of the two, Donne's originality was by far the more spectacular. One aspect of Donne's originality, in fact, was that he gave to the short lyric something of the flexibility, the urgent and profound expressiveness that came to be developed in dramatic blank verse. Donne's poetry was further remarkable for its fusion of passionate feeling and logical argument. Progression by reasoning was nothing new in Elizabethan poetry. But what distinguished John from, say, Sidney in this respect was the subtlety, incisiveness, and range of his thought, together with the sense that the play of intellect tended to become for him an emotional experience, and that conversely, when deeply moved, his mind worked even more rapidly. Thus, parting and consolation led him to contemporary beliefs about the universe, the scale of beings, human soul, and the nature of matter, to remote astronomical phenomena and the malleable properties of gold. His influence was widespread, and a number of poets followed his style and manner, so much so that he was regarded as the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry. In the Caroline period, the age of Charles I, 1625 to 49, there was a remarkable outburst of lyrical activity. Most of the lyricists, with the very notable exception of Herrick, were courtiers. On account of their leaning towards the king and the court party as against the Puritans or Roundheads, these lyricists cum courtiers have come to be classed in the history of English literature as cavalier poets or cavalier lyricists. End of page 113, now page 114. However, it may be pointed out that they did not use their muse as a tool of propaganda, political or religious. They kept their royalism away and apart from their poetic activity. Among the cavalier poets may be mentioned the names of Falkland, Faulkland, Falkland, Maine, Meyne, Maine, Cleveland, Habington, May, Randolph, and many, many more. However, here our purpose is to deal with only the more important ones. They are Herrick, Carew, Suckling, and Lovelace. Some common features. The output of the cavalier poets falls in a class on account of certain qualities which may be discerned, though in varying degrees, in the work of each one of them. But it may be pointed out that it is only the minor cavalier poets who are merely representative with comparatively less well-defined individualities of their own. Every one of the four major cavalier poets named above has his own individual approach and flavor, and that is the reason why he is a major poet. Yet they share some characteristics. For instance, they all wrote very short poems, very few of them comprising above 100 words. Further, even though they are both urban and urbane, they show an undisguised and sometimes intense love of such natural objects as trees, plants, birds, and country scenes in general. Then all of them exhibit an admiration for simplicity as against the sophisticated culture of the court. Again, none of them shows any real intensity of feeling or rapturous spontaneity we have come to associate with Elizabethan lyricists. Largely, their idioms and diction reflect the flavor of aristocratic speech, fluent, though a little slipshod and unamenable to the dulling discipline of any formal education. Ben Jonson and the Cavalier Poets. The other great formative influence in the early 17th century poetry was Ben Jonson. Jonson's non-dramatic verse did not show such an obvious originality or such a decisive breach with contemporary fashion as Donne's. Yet his different modification of the Elizabethan manner was almost equally significant. Even his songs had a greater neatness and point. They were more economical in method, and the best of them achieved a striking sureness of movement, a kind of controlled elan, which is different from the limpid Elizabethan flow. Apart from lyrics, including numerous songs from his plays and masques, Johnson wrote chiefly occasional verse epigrams, epitaphs, odes, and epistles. He rejected equally the Petrarchan convention, the Spenserian fluency and sweetness long drawn out, and with rare exceptions the sonnet form. For his models he turned from the French and Italians to the Latin lyric poet and epigrammatists, especially Catullus, Horace, and Martial. From these he learned a detached coolness of style which can unite with genuine feeling to give it restraint, stability, and permanence. Johnson's influence was best seen in the Caroline or Cavalier lyricists, in poets like Thomas Carew, John Suckling, Richard Lovelace, etc. Robert Herrick, 1591 to 1674. Herrick, by the consensus of critical opinion, enjoys the highest status among the Cavalier poets. This is the status which Douglas Bush also gives him in English literature in the earlier 17th century. However, Geoffrey Walton, in his essay on the Cavalier poets in Volume 2 of the Pelican Guides to English Literature, would place Carew above him. Herrick was the only Cavalier who was not a courtier. He was the first of the sons of Ben who came under his influence. Hardin Craig observes in A History of English Literature, he became Johnson's greatest disciple and actually realized a greatness in the field of classical lyric superior to that of Johnson himself. Along with Johnson, Herrick took for his model and inspiration the clear, objective, spirited, but perfectly ordered and lucidly worded poetry of the Latin poets like Ovid, Horace, Catullus, Martial, and the Greek poet Anacreon, possibly in his Latin version done by Henry Estienne. He does not seem to have paid much attention to Elizabeth lyricists before him, but his first guide was Saint Ben, whose aid he invoked in his poem, Prayer to Ben Jonson. Herrick was perfectly convinced of his immortality as a poet, and therefore very assiduously he preserved each and every scrap of his writing. His only book, Hesperides, or the works both humane and divine of Robert Herrick, Esquire, which appeared in 1648, contains about 1200 poems, few of which extend beyond 100 lines. Most of them are of the occasional type or of the nature of epigrams. Herrick is a poet of moods and moments and is perhaps incapable of sustained poetic expression, but he is seldom frivolous, inelegant, or unsophisticated. End of page 114, now page 115. As F. H. Moorman observes, he reveals lyrical power of a higher order, fresh, passionate, and felicitously exact, but at the same time meditative and observant. However, we have to agree with Geoffrey Walton that Herrick is a poet of a charmingly fanciful but simple sensibility. His moods and themes have variety but no complexity. The true metaphysical manner is beyond him. He sings mostly of women, love, wine and song, but he also exhibits a refreshing love for trees, plants and flowers, and often looks at them as emblems of human predicament, as for instance in the divination by a daffodil. When a daffodil I see hanging down his head towards me, guess I may what I must be. First I shall decline my head, secondly I shall be dead, lastly safely buried, or again see the last stanza of To Blossoms. But you are lovely leaves where we may read how soon things have their end, though ne'er so brave, and after they have shown their pride, like you, awhile they glide into the grave. But Herrick has not one but protean moods, Protean, protean moods, and is equally dexterous in the expression of them all. Cherry Ripe, To Julia, and are some of his best known poems. He is indeed the delight of all anthologists.